It's so great to see a room full of people who are interested in this topic and want to learn and nerd out with us on this. Thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here today alongside this fantastic panel of speakers. And I have Sarah tasked me with explain the Michigan mechanics in 20 minutes or less. Oof, I can talk about this for hours, y'all. So I'm going to try and restrain myself and keep us on time, because I don't want to be the person that's at fault for going over. Okay, so I work with Sarah in this really funny capacity on campus where I'm part researcher and part technical assistance provider for communities in Michigan. So for the past several years, the State Energy Office in Eagle has been funding Sarah and our team to help local governments in Michigan with understanding renewable energy planning and zoning and really translating that to what that means for them on the ground. Which is the umbrella term for this is the Renewable Energy Academy, which is Eagle's program to provide resources for local governments and that, which is really trainings, webinars, bus tours. I frequently take folks to bus tours, which are always so fun. Writing guidebooks, writing sample zoning ordinance language, just so folks have a starting point to then kind of tailor that to them. So my MO and my perspective on all of this is how I usually explain this to local governments. So we've already heard a lot, and I appreciate Nelson and Chair Scripps already teased the Michigan model here and there and some of these things. So this is my attempt at kind of like putting it all in one slide deck. What does PA 233 of 2023 do? It creates an option for a developer to ask Dan Scripps and his team to permit a grid-connected renewable energy project unless a local government has an ordinance in place that is a compatible renewable energy ordinance. There are additional triggers in this, but I'm going to not try to get too into the weeds. And as it has already been mentioned, the law passed in the fall of 2023, but actually option of state siting is only on the table since the fall of 2024, so a year later. We've already talked about kind of thresholds today. So these are the thresholds that are laid out in PA 233 specific to Michigan projects. So for a solar project, it would be solar projects with a nameplate capacity of 50 megawatts or larger. For people that think in acres, 500 approximately and up. So these are big projects. For wind energy systems, it's 100 megawatts of nameplate capacity, so everything that and larger would be subject to PA 233. And for battery or for energy storage systems generally, it's also that 50 megawatt nameplate capacity with an energy discharge capability of 200 megawatts an hour. And so anything lower than that is still subject to regular good old zoning like we know it in Michigan. There's two small fine print notes here, and I don't know if the folks in the back can read this, but a developer, as we've heard already today, is not required to go to the MPSC if a project that they're proposing is larger than these thresholds. It is really an option, a backstop option. And the other note down here is that all of these projects, we're not talking about eminent domain here. All of these projects involve a willing landowner in some capacity to lease their land or to sell their land to a renewable energy developer to make a project happen. This is where my slides get a little janky, I apologize, but I tried so hard to make these pretty for you. This is how I often talk about what are the options for local governments. And so the state law creates this concept of a renewable energy ordinance, a CREO, which really is a local ordinance constrained by the guardrails of section 2268 in the law, which there is a little bit of editorializing at the bottom, which is really referring to projects that are built under a CREO are pretty easy for a developer to meet and pretty fast, because the CREO process comes with a very strict timeline in which a local government needs to review such a project. PA 233 also now introduces the MPSC pathway, which are those same kind of CREO standards, but there's a lot added to it. 21 minimum conditions, there's evaluation criteria that the law spells out that the commission has to consider. And so it's similarly permissive standards as is in a CREO, but there really is a lot more due diligence and kind of follow-up compared to just what's in a CREO. And so what are these other two things? All local governments in Michigan do local zoning, or the 1,800 plus local units of government that do zoning in Michigan really are somewhere on the right side, where it's very likely they do not meet those strict CREO requirements, and I'll talk a little bit more in a second about why that is. But it's an ordinance that's not CREO. So any ordinance that's not CREO falls into the yellow or red bucket. And so what the key difference is between that is entirely what a developer for a particular project in a particular place finds economically viable and doable or workable. So the workable concept, and we've heard it earlier today already, is nothing necessarily that PA 233 talks about, but it is like that gray area that's left over, which is like the practicality of PA 233. And so a workable zoning ordinance would really be a local zoning ordinance that's stricter than a CREO, but it still makes room for renewables. It's something that a developer can work with, and ideally stays local and is highly context dependent. Whereas an unworkable ordinance is a local zoning ordinance that doesn't work for the developer. So that is the only difference there, is what the developer finds workable. Which probably, if you have an unworkable zoning ordinance on the books, that will kick a project to the MPSC. Okay, so what is in a CREO? For the zoning nerds among us, I'm one of you, Section 2268 is spelling out what can be in a CREO. And there are, for solar energy projects, there is a specific setbacks are laid out. I omitted the numbers here, but generally the things that are covered in a CREO are setback, sound, height, fencing, lighting for solar. There are some shadow flicker requirements additionally with wind, and with energy storage, importantly, is the compliance with the National Fire Protection Code of 855, specific for energy storage systems. I want to say, Sarah and I have been maintaining an energy zoning database for a couple of years, and feel like we're pretty in tune with what local governments across Michigan usually to put in their renewable energy ordinances, and none of them really meet those really stringent CREO requirements. There's always an additional layer of limiting location or measuring setbacks differently than what is proposed in a CREO. And I also want to say that no project that we have operational in Michigan was permitted under an ordinance as lax as a CREO, and I'll show you more about that later. I've already mentioned the timeline for a CREO is really quick, so 3 months is what the community has from receiving the application to deciding on it. So it's a really fast timeline compared to how long usually this process takes locally. And then Chair Scripps has already mentioned that as well. A developer can still go to the MPSC even if the local government has a true CREO, when it either doesn't act in time or if it denies an application, even though that application meets those 2268 standards, or if after a project has been announced, the community makes amendments to their zoning ordinance that are more restrictive. And Dan Scripps has already laid out as well that there's then a penalty for that, which is losing those intervenor funds that are crucial to enabling a local government to participate in the contested case process with the state. What's in the MPSC? Did you see what I did there? Yes, okay. It's the same top half. It's that same top half, but there's additional, it's the same standards, but with stronger due diligence. So you can see vegetative screening to kind of get at some of the visual impacts commonly found in solar zoning ordinances locally are included in the MPSC project, or flicker studies for wind, or sound monitoring, that after a project is operation or has started operations, that it actually sticks to those sound standards and requirements that are spelled out. So it's a lot more due diligence. Additionally, MPSC projects entail these 21 conditions that are spelled out in the application filing instructions. And importantly, and that is what excites me as a planner a lot, are those 3 bullets that are kind of on top of it, which the law explicitly spells out for the commission to consider, which are 1, developers have to consider feasible alternative locations for a project and explain why is it proposed here and not elsewhere. The impact on local land use and farmland. And thirdly, the percentage of land already dedicated to energy generation in a place, which is not a fully like a fair share approach, but it's kind of getting at this element of how do we concentrate infrastructure impacts on particular communities rather than everyone doing a little bit in an ideal world. Additionally, there are some labor requirements that developers have to comply with. There's very extensive and early consultation with state agencies that developers have to apply with, and pollinator ground cover underneath solar projects, and so on and so on. You see there's a lot more in there, and I do not know why this slide is so janky. Anyways, importantly, and this has been teased a little bit already, is that developers pay application fees to the commission, but importantly from me as a local government person, a host community agreement, so the law mandates the developer pays $2,000 per megawatt one time for the local government to use how they please, and intervenor funding, so the developer pays the money that enables the local government to participate in that contested case process and to really advocate for their voice as the project is being reviewed by the commission. There is a timeline for MPSC decision, and you'll see it's a lot longer than for a CREO. The commission has, upon receiving a complete application, a year to decide. And here's a quick breakdown from the local government perspective, the key milestones that our developers offers to meet with the local government. There's a public meeting in the local unit of government, the developer files the application, and then there's a lot happening with Team MPSC in that process, and then the MPSC approves or denies that project after a year. So why are we making this distinction of workable? And there are multiple reasons we believe workable ordinances, even though they're not appearing anywhere in PA 233, are a thing. And that really comes down to the long time frame of the MPSC process, the fact that the diligence and the process associated with the state permitting review is very sophisticated, and also, and Chair Scripps has already alluded to this as well, the fact that lots of developers are aiming to be and working towards being long-term partners in those communities and are very aware that state permitting is not necessarily popular in every community. And so, as zoning nerds, Sarah and I dug into zoning ordinances in Michigan and really looked at what, if we don't know what workable is, because it is so dependent on what the developer deems workable, then how can we know what local governments can kind of use as a starting point if they're planning on keeping it local, but a CREO is kind of too limited. So what can we point to that might be helpful for communities as they're considering a workable ordinance? And so we dug into all of the projects, wind and solar, that are operational in Michigan right now, and looked at their zoning ordinances that were in place when this project was permitted. So we pulled it all into a big spreadsheet and really realized none of these ordinances are as lax as a CREO, but at the same time, so all of these ordinances are more restrictive in some way, but not in all the ways. There's always a little bit of a little CREO here and there in these ordinances, but there's a lot more in there typically than a CREO. So even if the developer has the option to go to the state, why wouldn't they? And one of the keys to that really is the Renewables Ready Communities Award, which is an economic incentive for both developers and local governments to find a workable solution. The Renewables Ready Communities Award is a state grant by the State Energy Office in Eagle, provided to local governments that permit local projects locally. And so I showed you earlier in the MPSC process, there is this mandated $2,000 per megawatt payment to the local government paid for by the developer, and that kind of shifted the balance a little bit more towards the MPSC. And so what the RCA does is it kind of provides that counterpart to make sure that in either pathway, local or MPSC, there's some sort of financial benefit to the local government. And this is what the RCA does. So it's that host community agreement counterpart for locally approved projects. And it's not just interesting to local governments, but also to the development industry because it is paid for by Eagle rather than the developers themselves. It is more money, it's $5K rather than $2K. And it's similarly flexible in that local governments kind of can spend that money however they please. There's really limited strings attached, which is making it simple to kind of receive that, use that as you please, rather than the essential nexus questions. And this is where we get into planning, nitty-gritty and municipal planning law about like concerns about like the essential nexus and like takings. Like, I keep it there. Okay. Yes. So what I'm saying is, let's look at the numbers. This is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, so bear with me, but I still think numbers speak for themselves to a large degree as well. So since the state permitting path is on the table, fall of 2024, 9 applications totaling 1.6 gigawatt of mostly solar have been filed with the commission and are currently on the desk of MPSC staff to review. What we've been seeing is, so far, the state seems to be setting a pretty high bar. None of these projects have been decided on, and I don't think that we can expect, or we should expect, a decision on the very first project that has been filed before maybe late summer. I'm looking at my MPSC friends here. So there's still a lot unknown. No project has been decided on yet. But from what we've been seeing so far, us on the sidelines of watching the MPSC do their work, is really that the conditions that are in the AFIP, in the application filing instructions, are really trying to fill at some of these gaps that we know local governments care about, that the law omitted, such as vegetative screening. And also that the review of these applications is really rigorous. It's thousands of pages per application. It's kind of nuts. And the amount of incompleteness memos and the thoroughness that the staff has held to these applications is really setting a high bar, contrary to what Sarah and I were worried about at the beginning, was that it's going to be a rubber stamp. It doesn't look like it. On the other hand, locally, we had 6, and this is where it's apples to oranges because it's a different time frame. So since the fall of 2023, more than 6 gigawatts of projects have been approved locally. How do I know that? Is all of these communities have applied for and received the RRCA, which is an amazing way of like getting really up-to-date data, because as soon as a local government permits a project, they typically apply to the RRCA. And so lots of projects have been permitted locally since. And so wrapping up, I think personally the RRCA is hugely influential to make the Michigan model work, because it's really creating this balance and making both the state and local options reasonably comparative. And I have more ideas. So I think in unison, setting a high bar, making clear that you can't say no to projects, plus the RCA in combination really are kind of part of the secret sauce of the Michigan model. With that, I want to leave it for the next panel with the folks who are actually doing the work on the ground to share more about kind of why they think we are seeing these differences in numbers. But I'm going to wrap it up and would love to hear any questions you might have. Thanks.